Welcome to Crazy HOA Moments. This is what selective enforcement looks like. I am standing in my own driveway in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and a tow hook chain is swinging 6 inches from my face. The woman holding the other end is Kathleen Mitchell, the Beacon Hill HOA Board Fines and Enforcement Coordinator, and she is pointing at my guest's car like she just caught a felony in progress. Her mouth is already open, mid-yell, and I could see the little handheld stamp she carries everywhere, clutched in her free hand like a weapon. My name is irrelevant right now, because what matters is this. I am a veteran learning a trade in an apprenticeship program, I am on call for work and I cannot have my vehicle immobilized or towed, and I am trying to sell this house before the HOA buries me in liens and disclosures. Kathleen does not care about any of that. She cares that my buddy parked in an unmarked spot for 10 minutes while he helped me load tools, and she has decided that is a tow on-site violation. The tow truck is already here. The driver is standing next to her, arms crossed, waiting for her signal. I can hear the winch cable being tightened while Karen points, faces still unobstructed, and the landscaping contractor working 2 houses down is pretending not to listen. Kathleen smiles. "Keep talking," she says. "I love adding notes." The whole thing started 40 minutes ago. My buddy Jake stopped by to grab some welding clamps I borrowed last month. He pulled into the first open spot he saw on the street, helped me carry the stuff out to his truck, and left. Total time on site, maybe 10 minutes. I went back inside to finish packing because I have a job interview tomorrow morning and I need my work truck ready to roll. Then I heard the knock. Not a polite knock. The kind of knock that says you are already in trouble. I opened the door and Kathleen was standing there with her clipboard and her little stamp and a tow truck idling at the curb. She did not say hello. She said, "Your guest violated the parking policy and I have authorized immediate removal." I said, "What guest?" She pointed at Jake's truck, which was already gone. I said, "He left 20 minutes ago." She said, "I have a photo timestamp and tire chalk marks that prove intent to occupy overnight." I looked past her and saw the tow driver crouched next to my work truck, marking my rear tire with a yellow chalk stick. I said, "That is my truck, not his." She said, "I know. You are parked in a fire lane." I stepped outside. The curb in front of my house is not painted. There is no sign. I have parked there every day for 9 months. I said, "This is not a fire lane." She said, "The board revised the policy last month and all street parking within 15 feet of a driveway apron is now classified as fire lane adjacent." I said, "Where is that written?" She said, "It is in the updated handbook which was mailed to all residents." I never got a handbook. She said, "That is not my problem. The tow truck is here and the fee is $425 plus a $50 daily immobilization hold." I said, "You cannot tow my truck, I need it for work." She said, "You should have thought of that before you violated the policy." Then she pulled out her phone and took a photo of my truck, my face, and the chalk mark on my tire. She said, "I am documenting your refusal to comply." I said, "I am not refusing anything. I am asking you to show me the rule." She said, "Keep talking. I love adding notes." That is when the tow driver walked over with the wheel lift. He did not say a word. He just started positioning the truck. I said, "Wait. I am moving it right now." Kathleen said, "Too late, the dispatch order is filed." I said, "Filed where?" She said, "With the vendor, with the board, and with the county collections office if you fail to pay within 5 business days." I looked at the driver. I said, "You are really going to tow a veteran's work truck over a parking spot that is not even marked?" He shrugged. He said, "I just go where they tell me." Kathleen said, "You are not the first person I have corrected and you will not be the last." She said it like she was reading it off a script. I did not argue, because I already had something in my pocket she did not know about. 2 weeks ago, I filed a records request with the county to get copies of every tow authorization the HOA has issued in the past year. The request came back yesterday. I have not opened it yet, but I have it. I did not say anything about it then, because I wanted to see how far she would push. She won. That round anyway. I moved my truck into my garage and watched the tow driver leave. Kathleen stayed on my porch for another 5 minutes, writing on her clipboard. She did not look up. She just wrote. When she finally left, she walked past my mailbox and slapped a violation sticker on it. The sticker had no readable text, but I could see the red border and the HOA logo. I peeled it off and went inside. My phone rang 10 minutes later. It was the property management company. The woman on the phone said, "This is a courtesy call to inform you that you have been assessed a $250 fine for guest parking violations and a $150 administrative processing fee." I said, "I did not have a guest parked illegally." She said, "Our enforcement coordinator filed a report with photos." I said, "The guest left before any tow was called." She said, "The fine stands, and if you wish to dispute it, you must submit a written appeal within 10 days. I said, "I am submitting it right now." She said, "Written appeals must be mailed or hand-delivered, no email." Then she hung up. I called my neighbor Greg, the landscaping contractor who was working down the street when Kathleen showed up. He has lived in Beacon Hill for 6 years. He knows the drill. I said, "Did you see what just happened?" He said, "I saw the whole thing. She does that to everyone. Last year, she tried to tow my trailer because I parked it in my own driveway overnight." I said, "How did you fight it?" He said, "I did not. I paid the fine and moved the trailer. It is not worth it." I said, "I cannot do that. I am trying to sell this house, and if she stacks liens on my disclosures, I am screwed." He said, "Then you better get a lawyer, because she does not stop." He paused. Then he said, "I caught her on my doorbell camera about 3 weeks ago walking around your property at night with a flashlight. I do not know what she was looking for, but she was definitely snooping." I said, "Can you send me that footage?" He said, "Already done. Check your email." I opened the email. The video was timestamped 11:40 at night, 3 weeks ago. Kathleen was standing next to my truck with a flashlight, taking photos of my license plate and my inspection sticker. Then she walked around the front and looked in the windshield. She pulled out her phone and typed something. Then she left. The whole thing took about 2 minutes. I saved the video to 3 different places. Then I opened the records request I got from the county. It was a 40-page PDF. The first page was a cover letter from the county clerk saying that the Beacon Hill HOA board had issued 83 tow authorizations in the past 12 months. The rest of the document was a line-item log with dates, addresses, violation codes, and tow vendor names. I scrolled through it. Kathleen's name appeared on 71 of the 83 authorizations. The same tow vendor appeared on 68 of them. I kept scrolling. Then I saw my address. She had filed a tow authorization for my property 2 weeks ago, 4 days before Jake ever parked in front of my house. The violation code was guest parking, extended occupancy. The note said, "Resident history of non-compliance, high-risk repeat offender. I have lived here for 9 months. I have never received a single violation notice." I printed the whole thing. Then I called the management company back. I said, "I need the name and contact info for your legal department." The woman said, "We do not give that out to residents." I said, "I am not asking. I am telling you." I have a records request that shows your enforcement coordinator filing false tow authorizations, and I need to speak to someone before I file a complaint with the State Consumer Protection Office. She put me on hold. 2 minutes later, a man picked up. He said, "This is Daniel. I am the compliance manager." "What is your concern?" I said, "Your fines coordinator filed a tow authorization for my property 2 weeks before the alleged violation occurred, and I have a county log that proves it." He said, "Let me look into that and I will call you back." I said, "No, you are going to look into it right now while I am on the phone, or I am filing the complaint today." He said, "Hold on." He came back 4 minutes later. He said, "I see the entry. That was a preliminary enforcement flag, not a final authorization." I said, "It says tow authorization at the top." He said, "That is just the template." I said, "The template has my address, a violation code, and Kathleen's signature. That is not preliminary." He said, "I will need to review this with the board." I said, "You do that. In the meantime, I am appealing the fine and I expect a written response within 10 days. He said, "Understood." Then he hung up. I sat there for a minute, staring at the printed pages. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message said, "You need to stop harassing HOA staff or we will escalate this to law enforcement." I screenshot the text and saved it. Then I called the non-emergency police line. I said, "I just received a threatening text from someone claiming to represent my HOA." The dispatcher said, "Do you know who sent it?" I said, "No, but I can guess." She said, "We can file a report, but unless there is a direct threat of violence, there is not much we can do." I said, "Can you at least document it?" She said, "Yes. Give me your information." The next morning, I woke up to another violation sticker on my mailbox. This one was bright orange. I peeled it off and checked my truck. There was a yellow chalk mark on my front tire now, even though my truck was in the garage all night. Someone had opened my garage door and marked my tire while I was asleep. I checked my phone. Greg had sent me another video. This one was from his driveway camera, time-stamped at 2 in the morning. Kathleen was standing in my driveway with a flashlight and a chalk stick, leaning into my garage. She marked my tire, took a photo, and left. I forwarded the video to the compliance manager at the management company. I said, "Your enforcement coordinator is trespassing on my property at 2 in the morning and vandalizing my vehicle." I expect an immediate response. He did not reply. I forwarded the video to the police. The officer who filed my report yesterday called me back. He said, "We can charge her with trespassing if you want to press charges." I said, "I want to press charges." He said, "I will send an officer to take your statement." The officer showed up an hour later. He took my statement, watched both videos, and said, "This is pretty clear-cut. She is on your property without permission, marking your vehicle, and filing false reports." I said, "Can you do anything about it?" He said, "I can file a report and forward it to the DA, but honestly, this is going to be treated as a civil matter unless she does something more aggressive." I said, "She threatened to call the police on me yesterday and then sent me an anonymous threatening text." He said, "Do you have the text?" I showed him. He said, "That is harassment. I can add that to the report." I said, "What happens next?" He said, "The DA will review it and decide if they want to press charges. In the meantime, I would recommend getting a restraining order if she continues." I said, "How long does that take?" He said, "Depends on the judge. Could be a week, could be a month." I said, "I do not have a month." He said, "Then you need to talk to a lawyer." I called a lawyer that afternoon. The consultation was free. The lawyer listened to everything and said, "You have a strong case for harassment, trespassing, and possibly fraud if she is falsifying tow authorizations. The problem is, litigation takes time and money, and HOAs have deep pockets." I said, "I do not have deep pockets." He said, "Then your best option is to force a settlement. Gather as much evidence as you can, file a formal complaint with the state, and make it expensive for them to keep fighting." I said, "How do I do that?" He said, "Start with the tow vendor. If they are working with the HOA on a kickback scheme, that is a licensing violation. I can help you file a complaint with the State Transportation Board." I said, "How much does that cost?" He said, "Nothing. It is a public complaint." I said, "Then let us do it." He said, "I will draft the complaint and send it to you by end of day. You just need to sign it and submit it." I went home and started building the timeline. I had the county tow log, Greg's doorbell videos, the threatening text, the police report, and the management company's recorded phone calls. I also had photos of every violation sticker Kathleen had slapped on my property. I put everything into a single folder and backed it up. Then I got a call from the management company. Daniel, the compliance manager, said, "We have reviewed your appeal and we are denying it. The enforcement coordinator's actions were within policy and the fine stands." I said, "She filed a tow authorization before the violation occurred." He said, "That was an administrative error." I said, "An administrative error that just happened to list my address and a fake violation history?" He said, "If you wish to continue disputing this, you will need to appear before the board at the next hearing." I said, "When is that?" He said, 3 weeks from today." I said, "I need a written copy of the policy she claims I violated." He said, "It is in the handbook." I said, "I never received a handbook." He said, "That is not our problem." Then he hung up. I called Greg again. I said, "She is forcing me into a board hearing." He said, "Do not go. They will ambush you." Last year, they held a hearing for a guy who painted his front door the wrong color. They had 3 board members, 2 lawyers, and a stack of photos. He did not have anything. They fined him $2,000 and put a lien on his house. I said, "I am not going in empty-handed." He said, "Good luck." Then he said, "Hey, I know a guy who used to be on the board. He quit because he could not deal with Kathleen anymore. You want his number?" I said, "Yes." He sent it to me. I called the guy. His name was Tom. I said, "I heard you used to be on the Beacon Hill board." He said, "I was the treasurer for 2 years. I quit because Kathleen was running the whole thing like a personal fiefdom." I said, "Can you tell me anything about the tow vendor they use?" He said, "Yeah, her brother-in-law owns the company. She gets a cut of every tow." I said, "Can you prove that?" He said, "I tried." The board refused to audit the contract. That is why I quit. I said, can you testify to that if I file a complaint? He said, I can write a statement, but I am not going in front of the board. They will retaliate. I said, fair enough. Can you send me anything you have? He said, I kept copies of the budget reports. I will email them tonight. I said, thank you. He said, one more thing. Kathleen has been doing this for 5 years. You are not going to win by playing nice. You need to make it hurt. I said, I am working on it. He hung up. The budget reports came through at 8 that night. They showed 5 years of payments to the same tow vendor, averaging $40,000 a year. The contract had no competitive bidding, no board vote, and no audit trail. I added it to the folder. The next day, I went to the city parking office. I needed to find out if the HOA had any actual authority to enforce fire lane rules on a public street. The clerk at the counter said, HOAs cannot enforce fire lanes on public streets. That is a city function. I said, can you give me that in writing? She said, I can print you a copy of the municipal code. I said, please. She handed me 3 pages. The code was clear. Fire lanes must be marked with red curb paint and signage, both installed and maintained by the city. Private entities cannot designate fire lanes on public property. I asked for a second copy and had her stamp both. Then I asked if an HOA is falsely claiming fire lane violations and threatening to tow vehicles, who do I report that to? She said, you can file a complaint with the city attorney's office. I said, can I do that here? She said, no, you have to go downtown. I said, I will be there tomorrow. I went downtown the next morning. The city attorney's office is in the same building as the courthouse. I filled out a complaint form and attached copies of everything. The tow log, the municipal code, Greg's videos, the police report, and Tom's budget reports. The intake clerk said, this will take about 6 weeks to review. I said, I have an HOA hearing in 2 weeks. She said, we cannot expedite based on private deadlines. I said, understood. She stamped the form and handed me a receipt. I said, if I need to submit additional evidence, how do I do that? She said, just reference this case number. I took the receipt and left. On the way out, I saw a flyer on the bulletin board. It said the State Consumer Protection Office was holding a free legal clinic next week. I took a photo of the flyer. That afternoon, Kathleen showed up at my house again. This time, she had the tow truck with her. The driver was already hooking up to my neighbor's car. My neighbor was not home. Kathleen knocked on my door. I opened it. She said, I am notifying you that your vehicle is in violation of the updated overnight parking policy and will be towed if not moved within 30 minutes. I said, my truck is in my garage. She said, the policy now applies to all vehicles stored on the property, including garages, if they are visible from the street. I said, that is insane. She said, the board approved it last week. I said, show me the meeting minutes. She said, they are posted online. I said, no, they are not. I checked this morning. She said, then you are not looking in the right place. Keep talking, I love adding notes. She pulled out her stamp and slapped it on a violation notice. Then she handed it to me. The notice said I owed $650 for repeat offenses and non-compliance. I said, I am not paying this. She said, then we will file a lien and you will not be able to sell your house. I said, you are going to regret that. She smiled. She said, you are not the first person I have corrected and you will not be the last. Then she walked away. I did not wait. I drove straight to the State Consumer Protection Office. The legal clinic was not until next week, but I walked in and asked if I could speak to someone. The receptionist said, do you have an appointment? I said no, but I have an HOA filing fraudulent liens and working with a tow vendor on an illegal kickback scheme. She said, hold on. She made a phone call. 5 minutes later, a woman in a gray suit came out. She said, I am Michelle. I am an investigator. What do you have? I handed her the folder. She flipped through it for about 3 minutes. Then she said, this is a licensing violation, a fraud complaint, and possibly racketeering. How soon can you get me signed affidavits from your witnesses? I said, I can have them by tomorrow. She said, do that. I am opening a case file today. I said, what happens next? She said, we send a notice to the HOA and the tow vendor. They have 10 days to respond. If they do not, we can freeze their accounts and suspend their licenses. I said, how do I know they got the notice? She said, we send it certified. You will get a copy. I said, thank you. She said, one more thing. Do not go to that board hearing. Let them hold it without you. If they issue a lien while we have an open investigation, that is contempt, and we can go after them criminally. If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, hit that like button and subscribe, because it gets so much better from here. I left the office and called Tom, the former board treasurer. I said, I need you to write an affidavit about the tow vendor kickback. He said, I already told you I am not testifying. I said, you do not have to testify. The state just needs a signed statement. He said, what happens if the board finds out? I said, they are about to have bigger problems. He said, fine. Send me the template. I said, I will have it to you tonight. Then I called Greg. I said, I need you to sign an affidavit about the doorbell videos. He said, no problem. I already sent the videos to my lawyer. I said, why? He said, because Kathleen tried to fine me yesterday for having a trailer in my driveway. I told her to pound sand. She said she was filing a lien. I said, did she? He said, not yet. My lawyer sent her a cease and desist this morning. I said, good, send me a copy. He said, already done. I spent the rest of the night writing affidavits, one for Tom, one for Greg, one for myself. I printed them, signed mine, and emailed the others. By 10 that night, both of them had sent back signed copies. I scanned everything and sent it to Michelle at the state office. She replied within an hour. She said, this is solid. We are sending the notice tomorrow. In the meantime, do not engage with the HOA. If they contact you, forward it to me. I said, understood. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep. My phone buzzed at midnight. It was another text from the unknown number. The message said, you are making a big mistake. We have lawyers too. I screenshot it and sent it to Michelle. She replied immediately. She said, that is witness intimidation. Forward it to the police. I did. The officer who took my report called me at 7 the next morning. He said, we are issuing a warrant for Kathleen Mitchell. Do you know where she lives? I said, 2 streets over. He said, we will pick her up this afternoon. I said, what is the charge? He said, harassment and witness intimidation. If she contacts you again, call me immediately. The warrant was served at 3 that afternoon. I know because Greg called me. He said, there are 2 cop cars in front of Kathleen's house. They just put her in the back of one. I said, good. He said, what did you do? I said, I filed a complaint with the state and she threatened me. He said, holy hell. You are my hero. I said, it is not over yet. The board hearing is in 10 days. He said, are you going? I said, no. Michelle told me not to. He said they are going to issue the lien. I said, let them. If they do, the state can freeze their accounts. He said, this is amazing. I have lived here for 6 years and nobody has ever fought back. I said, somebody had to. He said, let me know if you need anything. I said, I will. Kathleen posted bail that night. I know because she showed up at my house the next morning. She did not knock. She just stood in my driveway and yelled. She said, you think you can destroy me? You think filing a complaint is going to stop this? I have been doing this for 5 years and nobody has ever touched me. I opened the front door. I said, you are violating a restraining order. She said, there is no restraining order. I said, check your mail. She said, I do not care. You are done. I am filing the lien today and you are never going to sell this house. I said, go ahead. She said, you are not going to win. I said, I already did. Then I pulled out my phone and played a recording. It was the conversation we just had. She heard her own voice saying, I do not care. You are done. I am filing the lien today. Her face went white. I said, the state investigator is going to love this. She turned and walked away. I sent the recording to Michelle. She replied, perfect. We are escalating this to criminal fraud. Stay safe. The board hearing happened without me. I got a certified letter 3 days later. It said I owed $2,400 in fines, late fees, and administrative costs, and that a lien had been filed with the county. I forwarded the letter to Michelle. She said, that is contempt. We are freezing their accounts tomorrow. I said, what do I do? She said, nothing. Let us handle it. The next day, the management company called me. It was Daniel, the compliance manager. He said, we need to talk. I said, talk. He said, The state has frozen our operating account and we cannot process payroll. We are willing to negotiate a settlement. I said, I am not negotiating. You are going to refund every dollar I was charged, clear the lien, and fire Kathleen Mitchell. He said, we cannot fire her. She is elected by the board. I said, then the board can remove her, or the state can shut you down. He said, I will bring it to the board. I said, you have 24 hours. He hung up. The board met in emergency session that night. I was not invited, but Tom called me afterward. He said they voted to remove Kathleen. She tried to argue, but 3 board members walked out and refused to continue until she left. She screamed at them for 10 minutes, then left. The board voted unanimously to terminate the tow contract, refund all disputed fines, and issue a formal apology. I said, did they mention me? He said they did not say your name, but everyone knows. I said, good. He said, you just took down the most powerful person in this HOA. People are going to remember that. I said, I hope so. The settlement letter arrived 2 days later. It was signed by the board president and the management company attorney. It said the HOA refunds the tow and immobilization fees and clears the ledger. All fines were rescinded. The lien was released. Kathleen Mitchell was removed from all leadership positions. The tow vendor contract was canceled pending investigation. I read it twice. Then I called Michelle. I said, it is over. She said, not quite. We are still pursuing criminal charges against Kathleen and the tow vendor for fraud and racketeering. The investigation is ongoing. I said, how long will that take? She said, 6 months, maybe longer. But you are clear. I said, thank you. She said, you did the work. I just filed the paperwork. I went to the gas station the next morning to fill up my truck. Kathleen was there, standing next to the pump. She saw me and walked over. She said, you ruined everything. I said, you ruined yourself. She said, I was just doing my job. I said, your job was to enforce the rules, not make up fake violations and threaten people. She said, nobody ever complained. I said, yes, they did. I pulled out a printed stack of complaints from the county records request. There were 37 complaints filed against her in the past 2 years. I said, you said nobody complains, and here is a stack of complaints. Her face went red. She said, those are not real. I said, they are certified copies from the county clerk. She grabbed for the papers. I stepped back. I said, the state investigator already has copies. You are done. She said, you are going to regret this. I said, no. You are. Then I got in my truck and left. The State Consumer Protection Office opened a formal case file 2 weeks later. The investigation took 8 months. In that time, Kathleen was charged with fraud, witness intimidation, and theft by deception. The tow vendor lost its license. The board replaced the entire management company. I sold my house in 3 weeks and made a $20,000 profit. The new owner said they bought it because they heard the HOA was finally cleaning up. I said, you are welcome. Kathleen pled guilty to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of witness intimidation. She was sentenced to probation and community service. The judge ordered her to repay $15,000 in fraudulent fines to residents. She was banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. I got a letter from her lawyer 6 months after I moved. It said she wanted to apologize. I did not respond. The final piece came from Tom. He sent me an email a year later. He said the board had approved a new parking policy, written by actual lawyers, with clear rules and no enforcement authority for individual board members. He said the HOA had hired a professional management company with oversight and audits. He said Kathleen moved out of the neighborhood. He said people still talk about what happened. He said I was a legend. I do not feel like a legend. I feel like someone who just wanted to park his truck in front of his own house without being harassed. But if standing up to an HOA tyrant and forcing accountability makes me a legend, I will take it. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.